Back in 1967, the Beatles released a song with an extremely simplistic chorus. In fact, the chorus was mostly just repeating the title over and over again. And the words of the chorus are, all you need is love, all you need is love, all you need is love, love is all you need. Well, that's pretty clear, isn't it? It's not hard to figure out what they're singing about. John Lennon wrote the lyrics, and he deliberately made them simple and easy to understand. The song was written for a TV show called Our World. It was the first live global television link. It would be seen by hundreds of millions of people around the globe. So the Beatles wanted the message to be easily understood and universally relevant. And you got to admit that they pretty much succeeded with that song. Over 50 years later, the song is often reprised as an anthem of unity. But going much further back in history, about 2,000 years before the Beatles' love anthem, Jesus made a statement about love that is not only universally relevant, but it's universally true. Jesus didn't say that love is all you need. As important as love is, it can be argued that a few more things are needed in life as well. What Jesus said was that love is the most important element in life. Of all the priorities and pursuits in life, love should take the number one spot. And Jesus made the statement in response to a lawyer who asked him a question. And we see that exchange in Mark 12, beginning with verse 28. One of the teachers of the law came and heard them debating. Noticing that Jesus had given them a good answer, he asked him, of all the commandments, which is the most important? The most important one, Jesus answered, is this. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this. Love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these. So Jesus taught about the quality of love that should characterize his followers, and it's a good lesson. But first, let's think about why Jesus taught this lesson at this particular time. Earlier in Mark 12, Jesus tells a parable to people who are gathered. Among those gathered are some religious leaders, and they don't like the parable at all. The parable Jesus taught was about a guy who owned a vineyard. He rented it out to some farmers, and at harvest time, he sent a servant to collect some of the harvest. Instead of giving the servant anything, they beat him up. So a second servant was sent, and he was beat up too. And the third servant was sent, and the renters killed him. So the owner sent his own son, thinking that certainly they would respect him. But the renters did not respect him at all, but they killed him, thinking that with him dead, they would inherit the vineyard for themselves. Well, in the parable, the servants stand for the Old Testament prophets that the religious leaders ignored and then killed. And the vineyard's owner's son represents Jesus, who the religious leaders would soon enough kill as well. So, as the religious leaders listened to the parable, their blood began to boil because they knew that Jesus was referring to them in the story, and they just didn't like it a bit. So, Mark 12:12 tells us that they began to look for an opportunity to arrest him. And what follows then are attempts by the religious leaders to trip Jesus up, try to make him say something that'd be the grounds for arrest. So they first asked Jesus if it was right to pay taxes to the Roman government. And they figured that if Jesus said yes, he'd be seen as pro-Roman and would lose respect of the Jewish people. If he said no, he'd be in deep trouble with the government. But Jesus answered, give back to Caesar what is Caesar, and to God what is God's. Well, next, the Sadducees asked Jesus a far-fetched question about marriage and the resurrection. The Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection anyway, so they asked this question to make Jesus look stupid. And basically they asked if a woman was married 7 times with each husband dying, who would be her husband at the resurrection? Well, Jesus answered, when the dead rise, they will neither marry nor be given in marriage. They will be like the angels in heaven. But the religious leaders would not give up. They were determined to make Jesus say something incriminating. So that brings us to today's text. which an expert of the Jewish law asked Jesus, "Of all the commandments, which is the most important?" Seems like a really good trick question. The rabbis had counted 613 commandments in the books of Moses, and they classified 365 as prohibitions and 248 as commands, and then they divided the commandments into those that carried more weight and those that carried less weight. But this lawyer was asking Jesus to pick just one commandment that stood above all the others. It seems like any answer Jesus might give would stir up some kind of controversy. But the trick question didn't stump Jesus. And his answer gives us some valuable insight into what our priorities should be as Christians. In Jesus' answer to the lawyer, he identifies love as a primary commandment. And specifically, we're to love God. Loving God is the greatest commandment, and that's good to know, because there are all kinds of commandments in the Bible. The book of Leviticus is all about laws and regulations, and some of them seem pretty strange to the modern reader. Now, as you read Leviticus, you'll find rules about food and childbirth, diseases, even mildew. And with each rule, it goes into minute detail. For mildew, how it's handled depends on the type of material affected, the color of the mildew, whether or not the mildew is spreading or not. So with so many laws, and with each law having so much detail attached, it's easy not to get overwhelmed. But Jesus didn't feel overwhelmed. He didn't even have to think about the question. For him, it was simple. The greatest commandment was to love God. This was important for the religious leaders to hear because they'd sometimes obsess on lesser commandments and put burdens on the people to meticulously obey every detail of ceremonial law. Then to complicate matters, they'd have their own interpretations, their own requirements of the laws. But they were focusing on the wrong thing. While they were obsessing with all these little laws, they didn't do a very good job with the most important law, that of loving God. Life is all about priorities, and we've got to be able to sort out what's insignificant from what is somewhat important to what is very important. Otherwise, we tend to pursue things that are just trivial. It's not enough just to be busy. Anybody can be busy. Judy once had a coworker whose husband went home every night, ate dinner, and then locked himself in a room so he could play online video games with strangers. It was not uncommon for him to play until 3 or 4 in the morning. So was he busy? Well, sure he was busy. But he was busy wasting time, shutting out real relationships and just diddling his life away. The religious leaders in Jesus' day were busy, but not with the most important things. While they spent all that time categorizing the various commandments of the Bible, they failed to obey the most important commandment. It wasn't enough they were doing all this religious stuff, all busy with it. It's not enough for us either. All religious ritual amounts to nothing if our heart isn't right with God. Now, the religious leaders, they'd certainly claim they loved God. That's what this obsession with all the law was about, making sure that they understood every one of them. And to be fair, Jesus taught elsewhere that obedience is the proof of our love to God. In John 14:15, he said, "If you love me, you will obey what I command." And really, there's only 2 ways to go. We're either obedient or we're rebellious. And a rebellious child isn't thinking about showing his love to his parents. A teenage child who stays out past curfew drinking with his friends, who steals petty cash from his dad, who skips classes at school, who lies about what he's doing, lies about who he's with and where he's been, he's not acting in a way that he's trying to please his parents. It's rebellion. It's fueled by resentment, maybe even hatred, but not by love. And in our sin, we are rebellious. When we fail to follow Christ's example, we are rebellious. When we fail to help the less fortunate, we're rebellious. And there's nothing loving about the rebellion of a child. But obedience demonstrates just the opposite. Obedience grows from respect. A child who loves his parents and respects their authority wants to please them. And Jesus could not have said it any plainer. If you love me, you will obey what I command. It's the proof of our love for Christ. We can profess our love for Christ with our mouths in the most impressive of words, but the proof isn't so much with what we say as in what we do. So as we said, the religious leaders would claim to love God, but Jesus wasn't fooled by them. Read Matthew 23, and you'll find Jesus giving a scathing condemnation on the religious leaders. And in verse 23 and 24, he says, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give 1/10 of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin. But you have neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. You blind guides, you strain out a gnat, but swallow a camel." So Jesus said that their lives were not characterized by love, but by hypocrisy. They tithe even their most insignificant belongings, such as the tiny herbs from their garden. But as they obsessed with these ritual matters, they ignored the more important things, such as justice, mercy, and faithfulness. They were obsessed with tiny matters, but ignored these significant things. So Jesus said we're to love God, but he didn't stop there. He not only gave the most important commandment, he included the second most important, just in case they were wondering. He said that in addition to loving God, we are also to love others. In fact, Jesus said to love your neighbor as yourself. We generally have no problem loving ourselves. If we are hungry, we feed ourselves. If we hurt ourselves, we reach for a Band-Aid. We spend hour upon hour entertaining ourselves with various pursuits. So Jesus says that the same degree of care we give ourselves should be given to our neighbors as well. Love to God is proven in obedience, and love to others is proven in service. Galatians 5:13 says to serve one another in love. We used to have our whole family at our house for Sunday lunch after church. At the time, both our boys were married, but neither had children yet. And so they brought over their dogs. Alan brought over Corduroy, and Robert brought over Scooter and Chloe. As part of the Sunday ritual, all the dogs received a dog biscuit when they came to our house. It was interesting to see their competition over these dog biscuits. It was every dog for himself. They didn't care a bit whether the other dogs got their share. All they cared about was that they got theirs. The dogs would line up as I handed out the biscuits, each vying to be first. And as I held out the biscuit with my fingers, the dogs would snatch it from my hand, and they'd quickly scamper off to devour it as quickly as possible. And this was especially true of Scooter and Corduroy, because they knew if they ate very quickly, they might be able to steal some of the biscuit of the slower eating dogs, Zara and Chloe. So they didn't care about each other's needs at all. They only really cared about themselves. They were dogs. Well, we're not dogs. Although I've known some people that are just as self-centered and selfish as the dogs. We are people. We're made in God's image. If we truly want to exhibit more of God's character in our lives, we've got to develop compassion for others, a love that serves. Philippians 2:3-4 says, "Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourselves. Each of you should look not only to your own interests, but also to the interests of others." In dog terms, we don't always have to be the one that gets the first biscuit. And sometimes we need to be willing to share our biscuit with others. So the most important commandment of all is to love God. In other words, of all the priorities we can make, of all the things we can do, of all the pursuits we can follow, loving God is number one. And then we're to love others. And Jesus then goes on to describe the quality of that love. Regarding our love for God, first we need to love him exclusively. There are to be no other gods. Mark 12:29 quotes from Deuteronomy 6:4. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength." That verse is probably the best known verse in the Old Testament. It was known as the Shema. And good Jews would recite the Shema twice every day, once in the morning and again in the evening. And the verse tells us that there's only one God. Other nations had multiple gods. They had different gods for different tasks or seasons. So to worship the multiple gods of other nations would mean that their heart would be divided. They might even have a favorite god who received more love than another one of the gods. But that was not the case with the God of Israel. He is the one God, the one and only true God, the God who made the world and sustains life. He's to be loved exclusively because there are no other true gods. We look back at Bible times and the problem they had with idol worship. And we wonder how anybody could get emotionally attached to a carving or a statue. It's not real. But really, we've not come that far. There are gods and idols all around us. The God of pleasure, the God of technology, the God of wealth, the God of food, the God of entertainment. And so it's very easy to give the real God lip service while the best of our energy and attention goes to another pursuit. God desires our best. God deserves our love. The Shema also tells us to love God enthusiastically with all our heart. And think of examples of people in the Bible who loved God. David worshiped by dancing. He was all excited because the Ark of the Covenant, that box that symbolized God's presence, was coming back home. And so he danced. And not like a nervous middle school student at his first school dance, but he danced like a wild man. 2 Samuel 6:14 says, David, wearing a linen ephod, danced before the Lord with all his might. He held nothing back. He left it all out there on the floor. He knew what it meant to love God and worship him with all his strength. And I imagine that by the time his worship dance was over, he was just exhausted. And then in the New Testament, we see the story of Mary as she poured expensive perfume on Jesus' feet. The kind of perfume that she poured on his feet was called nard. It was so expensive it was used as an investment, much like gold is today. The disciples who watched her pour this priceless liquid on Jesus' feet were baffled. Mary gave her prized possession to Jesus. She poured it on his feet. His feet. It was all gone in an instant. Before anyone had any time to stop her, the liquid was all spent. But in Mary, we learn a lesson in giving our all and giving our best. There wasn't even any left over for her own personal use. She gave it all to Jesus. And that's what Jesus wants from us too. He wants our best. He wants our all. Love him with all your heart, all your soul and strength. Hold nothing back. Then Jesus said, love others as yourself. Now let's consider a couple things about the commandment to love others. First, the Greek word is agapao. That's what's generally known as agape love, that pure, willful, sacrificial love that intentionally desires another's highest good. We're to love everyone in this way. It would be impossible to love everyone with a romantic love or the love of a friend, but we can strive to love others as God loves them. The second commandment about loving God and loving others is linked. 1 John 4:19 through 21 says, we love because he first loved us. Whoever claims to love God yet hates a brother or sister is a liar. For whoever does not love their brother and sister whom they have seen cannot love God whom they have not seen. And he has given us this command: anyone who loves God must also love their brother and sister. There's no quote from Linus, one of the characters in the Peanuts comic strip. He's talking with Lucy, who comments that Linus could never be a doctor because he doesn't love mankind. Well, Linus strongly disagrees. He says, I love mankind. It's people I can't stand. Well, we see the obvious humor in that statement because it's impossible to love mankind without loving people. But there are some people who might insist that I love God, but it's people I can't stand. But that doesn't work either, does it? Because the Bible makes it clear that if you don't love people, you can't love God. It's impossible. The person who hates others does not have a clue about loving God. So the Beatles sang All You Need Is Love. It's a great song with a positive sentiment. But far more relevant and eternally true are the words of Jesus when he said that the most important commandments of God are to love him with our whole being and to love others as ourselves. Of all the things we can pursue and prioritize, loving God and loving others must be foremost in our lives.